Auditing depends on evidence, because an audit conclusion is only as credible as the proof that supports it. When I evaluate whether a control is performing, I am not judging intent, and I am not accepting verbal assurances as substitutes for verification. I am looking for artifacts that show what was supposed to happen, what actually happened, and whether the difference between those two states is acceptable under the requirements in scope. Evidence also anchors time, which is essential, because a control that works today but failed for months before today is not a reliable control. If you approach auditing with that mindset, evidence collection becomes less about paperwork and more about building a defensible story of control performance. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to the CISS books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series.
A compliance audit is fundamentally a comparison between requirements and reality, and it looks at implemented controls as well as observed operation.
Requirements can come from laws, regulations, standards, contracts, or internal policies, but they all share the same expectation that an organization can demonstrate adherence.
Implemented controls are the safeguards that exist in design and configuration, such as access restrictions, encryption settings, change approvals, or monitoring rules. Observed operation is the harder part because it asks whether those safeguards are actually used consistently, at the right times, and across the right systems. The audit outcome depends on both, because a well-designed control that is not executed is not a functioning control, and a well-executed activity that does not meet the requirement is still non-compliant.
Evidence comes in many forms, and you should think of it as a portfolio rather than a single document type. Logs show activity and system behavior over time. Configurations show the intended technical state of systems, and tickets show how work was requested, approved, executed, and closed. Policies and standards explain what the organization claims it will do, while approvals and sign-offs demonstrate governance decisions like access grants, exception acceptance, or release authorization. Each type of evidence answers a different question, and audits are strongest when multiple types converge on the same conclusion. For example, a policy might require review of privileged access, a ticket might show the review occurred, and logs might confirm the access was actually restricted and monitored. That triangulation is what turns evidence into assurance. Evidence quality depends on authenticity, completeness, and clear time boundaries, and those three properties are where many audit programs quietly struggle. Authenticity means you can trust that the evidence is what it claims to be, that it was produced by the stated system or process, and that it has not been altered in a way that changes meaning. Completeness means the evidence covers the population or period it needs to cover, rather than being a convenient slice that omits failures or gaps. Clear time boundaries mean you can identify the exact period the evidence represents, such as a defined quarter, a defined audit window, or a defined retention interval, and you can show continuity within that window. Without time boundaries, you cannot prove the control operated consistently, and you end up proving only that the control existed at a single point in time. Because an audit cannot usually test every system and every transaction, sampling is used to select representative systems, transactions, or users for testing. The purpose of sampling is to draw a credible conclusion about a broader population by examining a smaller subset that reflects how the control operates in practice. A thoughtful sample avoids cherry-picking, and it is structured to include typical cases and also cases that are likely to reveal weakness, such as high-privilege users, high-value systems, or peak operational periods. Sampling also needs documentation because the rationale for selection is part of the defensibility of the audit. If you cannot explain why the sample is representative, then any conclusion drawn from it becomes vulnerable to challenge. Sampling is not a shortcut, and it is a method that must be applied with discipline. Walkthroughs complement sampling by tracing a process end to end to confirm consistent execution across steps and teams. In a walkthrough, I follow a single instance of a process, such as a change request, an access approval, an incident response action, or a data deletion request, from initiation to completion. The value is that it reveals handoffs, decision points, and the practical friction that policies often ignore. Walkthroughs also expose where evidence is generated, where it is stored, and where it is lost, which helps you understand whether the control can be proven at all. A process can be compliant in intent but non-compliant in execution if one step is routinely bypassed or informally handled. When you see the full chain, you can identify whether consistency is engineered or merely hoped for. Interviews are another core audit technique, and their purpose is to clarify intent, roles, and operational understanding of procedures rather than to collect opinions. A good interview confirms whether people understand what they are supposed to do, why they do it, and how they know they did it correctly, and it also reveals whether responsibility is clearly assigned. Interviews help identify where procedures are ambiguous, where training is incomplete, or where teams rely on tribal knowledge that does not survive turnover. They also provide context for interpreting evidence, because a log entry or a ticket can be meaningless without understanding how the workflow is designed. However, interviews are not evidence by themselves, and they must be supported by artifacts that demonstrate what actually occurred. The interview helps you ask better questions and find the right proof.
Observation adds another layer of validation because it confirms what happens in practice, not only what is documented. Policies and procedures often describe an ideal workflow, but observation shows the real workflow, including informal steps, workarounds, and tool behaviors that people may not even recognize as deviations. For example, observing how a team approves changes, manages privileged sessions, or responds to alerts can reveal whether controls are embedded in daily operations or applied only when someone remembers.
Observation is especially valuable when controls depend on human action, because human consistency is difficult to guarantee without automation or enforcement mechanisms.
It also helps you detect where evidence is generated but not retained, such as approvals that occur in chat tools without proper logging.
In that sense, observation is both a control test and an evidence discovery method.
Chain of custody is the discipline that protects evidence integrity, especially when evidence might be used for investigations, disputes, or enforcement actions. The basic idea is that you should be able to show who collected the evidence, when it was collected, where it was stored, who accessed it, and whether it was modified. This matters because evidence can be challenged, and if you cannot demonstrate integrity, then even accurate artifacts can be dismissed as unreliable. Chain of custody is not only for criminal cases, and it is relevant whenever there is a meaningful consequence attached to audit outcomes. Strong chain of custody practices typically include access control, logging of access, checksums or hashes where appropriate, and clear procedures for handling copies and exports. The goal is to preserve trust because trust in evidence is the foundation of trust in the audit. Evidence storage is a control area on its own because storing evidence creates a new data set that must be protected and retained in alignment with obligations. Evidence frequently includes sensitive details such as system configurations, user identities, access histories, and incident artifacts, and those details can become an attack target. Storage therefore requires access controls that enforce least privilege so that only authorized roles can view or modify evidence repositories. Retention must align to regulatory, contractual, and business needs, which means you keep evidence long enough to satisfy obligations, but not so long that you accumulate unnecessary exposure. You also need to consider lifecycle management, including how evidence is archived, how it is retrieved during audits, and how it is disposed of when retention periods expire. If evidence storage is weak, you can turn a compliance program into a confidentiality problem. Control testing is the stage where evidence is mapped to control objectives and requirement statements, and that mapping must be explicit to be defensible. A requirement statement is the external or internal obligation, such as a mandate to restrict access, to review changes, or to retain logs for a defined period. A control objective expresses what the safeguard is meant to accomplish, such as preventing unauthorized access or ensuring changes are authorized and traceable. Evidence is then selected to demonstrate that the objective is met and that the requirement is satisfied during the audit window. Good mapping avoids vague references and instead ties specific artifacts, such as a configuration snapshot and a sample of review tickets, to the requirement that is being tested. When mapping is clear, reviewers can reproduce the logic, and when mapping is unclear, findings become subjective. Findings are how audits communicate deviations, and strong findings describe the deviation, the impact, and the requirement reference in a way that supports remediation. The deviation is the observed difference between what is required and what is happening, and it should be stated plainly without drama. The impact explains why the deviation matters, such as increased risk of unauthorized access, reduced ability to detect incidents, or failure to meet a contractual obligation. The requirement reference ties the finding to the specific control expectation, which prevents debates about whether the auditor is applying personal preferences. A good finding also avoids speculative conclusions and instead sticks to what can be supported by evidence and reasonable inference. That balance is important because findings must stand up to scrutiny from technical teams and governance stakeholders. Management responses are part of the audit record, and they document remediation plans, dates, and responsible owners so that findings lead to closure rather than to recurring debate. A management response should name what will be done, who will do it, and when it will be completed. And it should also address interim risk handling if remediation will take time. The response should be realistic, because overpromising in an audit response is a way to create future non-compliance when deadlines are missed. Ownership must be unambiguous, because vague ownership is one of the most reliable predictors of stalled remediation. Validation steps should also be included so that closure is based on evidence that the control now performs, not on a statement that a project was completed. In a mature program, management responses become a mechanism for accountability and resource alignment.
Evidence collection supports trustworthy audit results and accountability because it turns compliance into something that can be demonstrated, challenged, and improved.
When evidence is authentic, complete, and bounded in time, audit conclusions become defensible and consistent across different auditors and different periods. When sampling, walkthroughs, interviews, and observation are used thoughtfully, you build a picture of control operation that is grounded in reality rather than in theory. When chain of custody and secure storage protect integrity, evidence remains reliable even under dispute or investigation. The practical outcome is that auditing stops being a seasonal fire drill and becomes a continuous capability that helps the organization understand how controls perform and where they need to be strengthened.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.